Little boy begged outlaws to end his stepdad's life. What they did left everyone speechless. The boy stood in the center of the dirt road, with dust settling around his boots like a prayer. No one would hear. And behind him, 4 men with guns and histories written in scars watched him with the kind of stillness that comes before violence or mercy, though which one nobody could say. His name was Thomas Webb, and he was 11 years old, and he had walked 16 miles through sage and scorpion country to find these men because he believed they were the only ones in the territory mean enough or desperate enough to do what needed doing. The sun hung low and orange behind the false front buildings, casting long shadows that made the boy look smaller than he was, which was already small enough. The town of Redemption Flats was the kind of place that collected broken things and broken people, where the saloon stayed open until someone got shot, or until dawn broke, whichever came first, and where the only law was whatever law you could enforce with your fists or your gun. One of the men, the one they called Cord, had a rifle across his shoulder and a face that looked like weathered fence posts, all angles and hard lines carved by wind and sun, and years of squinting into distances that offered nothing but more distance. He spat tobacco juice into the dust and said nothing, just stood there with his weight on one leg, like a man who'd learned long ago that patience was just another name for survival. The second man, younger, maybe 25, wore a black hat pulled low, and had eyes that darted like a horse that's been beaten, nervous energy radiating from him in waves. And his name was Jimmy Cross, and he kept one hand near his pistol, because that's what you did in towns like this when strangers appeared, especially when those strangers were children with split lips and desperation in their eyes. The third was Mexican, older than Jimmy, but younger than Cord, with silver conchas on his belt, catching the dying light like small moons, and he smoked a thin cigar that smelled of cherry wood and tobacco. And his name was Raul Mendoza, and he studied the boy the way you study clouds before a storm, looking for patterns, looking for meaning, looking for what comes next. The fourth man stood slightly apart from the others, older than all of them, maybe 50, with a gray beard that reached his chest and a long coat despite the heat that made the air shimmer and dance, and his name was Everett Stone, and men in 3 states and 2 territories knew that name the way you know the names of rivers that drown people or mountains that kill climbers. Everett Stone had killed 17 men, by his own accounting, maybe more if you counted the ones he wasn't sure about, the ones who might have died from their wounds later, or might have survived to hate him from a distance. He'd robbed trains and banks and stages, burned buildings and broken bones, and once he'd tracked a man for 3 weeks across desert country, just to settle a score over a woman whose name he couldn't even remember anymore. He wore 2 pistols, one on each hip, the handles worn smooth from use, and there was something about his eyes that made you think of winter, cold and patient and merciless. The boy's hands trembled, but he kept them at his sides, and he did not cry, even though his left eye was swollen shut, purple and black like a thundercloud, and his lip was split down the middle, crusted with dried blood, and there were bruises on his ribs that made breathing hurt, made every inhalation a reminder of what had been done to him, and why he was standing here in front of 4 killers with $43 and a request that would either save his life or end it. If you love real Western tales where honor and survival collide, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. The boy had rehearsed what he would say for 3 days while hiding in a canyon wash 20 miles south, drinking alkali water that tasted like metal and regret, eating nothing but 2 biscuits he'd stolen from the pantry before he ran, before he slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness and started walking toward the only hope he could imagine. During those 3 days, he'd thought about his mother and about the man who called himself her husband, and he'd thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways he might die or fail or make things worse, but he kept walking anyway, because staying was a slower kind of death, and at least this way, he was doing something. He'd slept in the rocks with rattlesnakes for company, and woken to find a tarantula crawling across his leg, and he'd lain perfectly still until it moved on, because even spiders deserved their space in this hard land. Now, with these 4 pairs of eyes on him, the words he'd rehearsed felt too small for what he needed, inadequate and thin, like trying to hold water in his hands. "I got money," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word, betraying the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Cord spat again, a brown stream that darkened the dust, and Jimmy Cross shifted his weight from one foot to the other, like he couldn't quite stand still. And Raul Mendoza just smoked and waited, and Everett Stone took 1 step forward. Just one, his boots making no sound despite the gravel, moving with the kind of economy that comes from decades of dangerous living. "How much money?" Everett said. Not a question. Just words flat as the horizon, flat as the mesa tops that surrounded this miserable town, like the walls of a prison. The boy reached into his pocket slowly, because sudden movements around armed men were how you stopped living, how you turned from a person with problems into a corpse with none. And he pulled out a leather pouch that chinked with the promising sound of coins, and he held it out like an offering to gods he didn't believe in anymore, if he ever had. $43, Thomas said, and saying the number out loud made it seem both like a fortune and like nothing at all. "I've been saving since I was 8. Did chores for Mr. Henderson at the feed store, mucked stables for the livery, ran errands for anyone who'd pay me a nickel. I saved every penny, never spent nothing on candy or nothing else." The words came faster now, spilling out like water from a broken dam. Everett Stone took the pouch and weighed it in his palm like he was weighing something more than money. Weighing intentions, maybe. Weighing desperation. And then he opened it and looked inside at the collection of coins, pennies and nickels and dimes, and a few quarters, the accumulated wealth of a child's labor over 3 years. He poured some into his other hand, let them catch the fading light, then poured them back. $43 is a lot of money for a boy, he said. That's months of work. Years, maybe. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. "What do you want done for $43? Everett said, and the air felt charged suddenly, electric, like right before lightning strikes. The boy's stepfather was named Marcus Webb, though Thomas didn't share his blood and wouldn't speak his Christian name out loud because names had power, and Thomas didn't want to give that man any more power than he already had. Marcus had married Thomas's mother 2 years ago, after Thomas's real father died of fever, died coughing blood into a handkerchief, and for the first 3 months, Marcus had been kind, or at least pretended to be, bringing candy from town and fixing the fence and speaking soft. But then the kindness fell away like paint from old wood, and what was underneath was something mean and broken. It started with shouting, then shoving. Then his mother wearing long sleeves in summer and walking careful like her ribs hurt. And Thomas had tried to stop it once, stepped between them when Marcus raised his hand, and Marcus had backhanded him so hard, Thomas saw stars that weren't in the sky and tasted blood in his mouth for 3 days after. After that, Thomas learned to be invisible, to move quiet through their 2-room cabin, to work the small plot of land they rented without speaking, to eat what little he was given and expect nothing more. His mother would look at him sometimes with eyes full of apology and grief, but she never said run, and she never said help. And Thomas understood that she was as trapped as he was, maybe more, because women in 1887 in territories like this had even fewer choices than boys, had almost no choices at all. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had come home drunk and angry about some slight at the mercantile, and he'd beaten Thomas's mother until she couldn't stand, until she had to crawl to the water bucket, and then he'd locked her in the root cellar for 2 days with no food or water. And when he finally let her out, she was different, quieter, like something inside had finally broken beyond repair. That night, while Marcus slept off his whiskey, Thomas had taken the money from the coffee tin, where he'd been hiding his small savings, and he'd left before dawn. Walked out into darkness, with nothing but determination and fear. Thomas felt his throat close up, but he forced the words out, because he'd come too far to stop now. "I want you to kill my stepfather," he said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been when it was just a thought in his head during those 3 days in the canyon. The words hung there between them like something solid, something that couldn't be taken back. Jimmy Cross laughed, just a short bark of sound that had no humor in it, and Cord shook his head slow, like he'd seen too much in this world to be surprised, but this somehow still registered, and Raul Mendoza stopped smoking and looked at Everett like this was his decision to make, like the other 3 would follow whatever path he chose. Everett handed the pouch back to Thomas, pressed it into the boy's palm. "We don't kill for children," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Go home, boy. Forget you ever came here." But Thomas didn't take his hand back, and he didn't move, and he didn't lower his eyes, and he said, "He's gonna kill my mother if somebody doesn't stop him." His voice was steady now, steadier than it had been, because this was the truth, and the truth had its own kind of strength, its own kind of power. He beat her till she couldn't walk last month, had to crawl to the water bucket. He locks her in the root cellar when he's angry, which is most days now. Keeps her down there in the dark with the potatoes and the spiders for hours, sometimes overnight. He says he owns her, says she's his property and he can do whatever he wants. Last week he put a knife to her throat, right here, and Thomas touched his own throat, where the artery pulsed. And he said next time she talks back he'll finish it. The words hung in the air like smoke from Raul's cigar, visible and heavy and impossible to ignore. And nobody spoke for a long moment, while the sun continued its descent and the shadows grew longer, and somewhere down the street a piano played badly, someone murdering a melody in the saloon. A crow called out harsh and lonely from the roof of the general store, and a wind came up from the south, carrying dust and the smell of horse manure and something else, something like rain that wouldn't fall for another month, at least. Everett Stone was thinking about his own mother, who died when he was 12, thinking about her face, which he could barely remember now except in dreams, thinking about the man who'd called himself her husband, thinking about the sound of fists hitting flesh and bone, about crying that got quieter over the years until it stopped altogether. He was thinking about how he'd run to the neighbor's house through the snow to get help, and how the neighbor had said it wasn't his business, and how he'd run back home and found his mother on the floor not moving. He'd lived with that for 38 years, carried it like a stone in his chest, and he'd told himself that the killing he did was separate from that, was just business, just survival. But standing here in the orange light, with this boy's split lip and swollen eye, something felt different, felt wrong, like a note played sharp in a familiar song. He looked at Cord, and Cord shrugged one shoulder, and he looked at Jimmy Cross, who'd stopped laughing and was staring at the ground, and he looked at Raoul, who met his eyes and nodded once, very slight, and that small gesture decided everything. "Where's your cabin?" Everett said finally, and Thomas felt something unclench in his chest, some desperate hope he hadn't let himself feel. 6 miles east, Thomas said. Past the Red Mesa, down in a valley near a dry creek. Everett put one hand on Thomas's shoulder, heavy and warm. "We'll ride out there tomorrow, at dawn." Thomas's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back and said, "Thank you." But Everett shook his head and said, "Don't thank us yet, boy. You might not like what we do. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease." But Thomas just nodded, because whatever price there was, he'd already decided to pay it. They rode out at dawn, 4 men on 4 horses, with Thomas on a 5th horse, borrowed from the livery, and the land was gray and flat, and the air smelled like sage and dust, and something ancient, something that had been there long before people came, and would be there long after they were gone. Thomas led them along a cattle trail that wound between sandstone formations that rose like the bones of giants from the earth, past a dried creek bed where bones lay white in the gravel, the skeletal remains of a cow, or maybe a horse, picked clean by coyotes and ravens in time, past a stand of cottonwoods that whispered in the wind like gossips, sharing secrets about everyone who passed beneath their branches. He kept looking back at the 4 men behind him, at Everett in his long coat, with the collar turned up against the morning chill, at Cord, with his rifle across his saddle, and his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit, at Jimmy Cross, who seemed nervous and kept touching his gun like it was a talisman, at Raoul, who rode easy in the saddle like violence was just another kind of weather. Thomas had expected them to ask more questions, to plan what they'd do. But nobody spoke, and the silence felt heavy with intention. Felt like the silence before thunder. The sun climbed higher as they rode, burning off the morning gray and revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the land opened up into low hills covered with scrub brush and cholla cactus, and somewhere a hawk circled, high and patient. When they reached the ridge overlooking his family's cabin, Thomas stopped and pointed down into the shallow valley where a small structure squatted against the earth, like something that had grown there naturally. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and gray. "That's it," Thomas said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. "He's probably inside. My mother, too." Everett studied the cabin for a long moment, his eyes tracking the layout with the practiced assessment of someone who'd raided more places than he could count, noting the single door that faced south, the one window facing west, the outhouse 50 yards back, the root cellar door set into the ground near the east wall. "You stay here," Everett said to Thomas, and it wasn't a suggestion. "No matter what you hear, you stay here, you understand?" Thomas wanted to argue, but something in Everett's eyes made argument impossible. So he just nodded and watched as the four men rode down toward the cabin, their horses picking their way carefully down the slope, kicking up small clouds of dust that caught the morning light and glowed briefly like halos before settling back to earth. Marcus Webb was splitting wood behind the cabin when he saw them coming, working with the kind of methodical violence he brought to everything, bringing the axe down hard enough to split the logs and sometimes bite into the chopping block beneath. His first thought, when he saw four armed men riding toward his property, was trouble, and his second thought was that maybe he could talk his way out of whatever this was because he'd talked his way out of things before, had convinced the sheriff in his last town that his first wife's broken arm was an accident, had convinced himself that what he did behind closed doors was nobody's business. He set down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants and walked around to the front to meet them. And he was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, thin and careful. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, when they stopped their horses 15 feet away. "What brings you out this way?" Everett dismounted slow, and the others stayed on their horses, and Everett walked forward until he was maybe 6 feet from Marcus, close enough to see the broken veins in his nose, the yellow in his eyes, the way his hands curled into fists and then uncurled. "You Marcus Webb," Everett said, not a question. "That's right," Marcus said, and his smile tightened. "Do I know you?" Everett didn't answer, just stood there looking at Marcus the way you look at something you're about to break. "Your boy came to see us," Everett said finally. "Asked us to do a thing." Marcus's face changed then, the smile disappearing completely, replaced by something darker. "That little bastard," he said, and anger flared hot and immediate. "Where is he?" He turned toward the cabin, but Cord raised his rifle and levered around, and that sound stopped Marcus mid-step. "Your boy says you beat his mother," Everett said, his voice flat and hard. "Says you put a knife to her throat. Says you lock her in the cellar." Marcus turned back, and his hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from rage. "That boy's a liar. My wife is fine. She's inside if you want to ask her." But before Everett could respond, the cabin door opened, and a woman stepped out, thin as wire, bruises fading yellow-green on her cheek, one arm held close to her ribs, like they hurt. She looked at the four-armed men, and then at Marcus, and then back at the men, and she didn't say anything, but her eyes said everything. Everett saw her, and something in his chest tightened, and he looked at Marcus and said, "You got a choice here. You can ride out of this territory today and never come back, leave these people in peace, or you can stay and see what happens." Marcus laughed, a bitter sound like breaking glass. "You think you can just ride onto my property and threaten me? She's my wife. That boy is under my roof. You got no right." Raul Mendoza climbed down from his horse then, slow and deliberate, and he walked over to where Thomas's mother stood, and he looked at her gently and said, "Señora, do you want this man to leave?" His voice was soft, respectful. The woman looked at him, and then at Marcus, and tears started down her face, but she nodded, just once, very small. Raul looked back at Marcus and said, "There is your answer." Marcus's hand moved toward the knife at his belt, but Cord's rifle swung around and pointed at his chest, and Cord said 2 words, "Don't try." And Marcus froze. The morning stretched out, tense and brittle, and a wind came up, carrying the smell of rain that wouldn't fall. Everett stepped closer to Marcus, so close they were almost touching, and he spoke in a voice so low only Marcus could hear. "I got a mother once," Everett said. "Man beat her till she died. I was a boy like Thomas, and I couldn't stop it. I've been living with that for 38 years. I've been doing bad things, and none of it ever made what happened to her feel right. But I can stop you. I can make sure you don't do to them what that man did to my mother. So you got a choice. You can get on that horse and ride out of here and never come back. Or I can end you right here, and nobody will ever find enough of you to bury. I'll make sure you suffer for days before you die." Marcus Webb looked into Everett Stone's eyes and saw something there that made his blood run cold. Saw death, patient and certain, and all the rage in him collapsed into fear. "I'll go," he said, his voice shaking. "I'll leave." Everett stepped back and nodded toward the corral. "Take one horse. Leave the other for them. Take nothing from the cabin. You got 5 minutes." Marcus walked to the corral like a man in a dream, moving stiff and mechanical, and he saddled one of the horses with hands that fumbled twice, and he climbed up and looked back once at the cabin, at his wife, at the 4 armed men. He looked like he might say something, but Cord raised his rifle again, and Marcus dug his heels in and rode north toward the ridge, and they watched until he was a dark speck against the gray sky, and then nothing at all. Thomas's mother sat down on the cabin steps and put her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook with sobs that might have been relief or grief or both, and Everett walked over and stood near her. "He won't come back, ma'am. Men like that are cowards when someone stands up to them." She looked up at him, and her face was wet, and she said, "Thank you." Barely a whisper, and Everett just nodded. Thomas came down from the ridge riding fast, and when he reached the cabin he jumped from his horse and ran to his mother, and she stood and caught him, and they held each other like people drowning, who'd found something to hold on to. Everett watched them, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, something warm and painful at the same time, like thawing frostbite. He turned to remount, but Thomas pulled away from his mother and ran over and grabbed Everett's coat sleeve. "You didn't kill him," Thomas said, confused. Everett looked down at the boy's swollen eye, at his split lip. He knelt down so they were at eye level. "Killing him would have been easy," Everett said. "But making him live with being beaten by his own cowardice, making him run like a dog, that's harder for men like him. He'll remember riding away in fear more than he'd remember dying quick. And your mother won't have to live knowing her son paid to have a man killed." Thomas thought about this and finally nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather pouch, but Everett shook his head. "Keep it. Buy some lumber and fix that porch. Buy your mother something nice. Buy yourself something sweet in town." Thomas's eyes filled with tears, and he said, "I don't know what to say." Everett put his hand on Thomas's head, rough and brief. "Say you'll take care of her. Say you'll grow up to be the kind of man who protects people instead of hurting them. That's enough." He stood and looked at Thomas's mother. "You want to thank me. You grow up different than him. Different than me. You find some good woman someday, and you treat her with kindness. You have sons, and you teach them the same. That's how you thank me." He climbed onto his horse, and the others were ready to ride, and Everett nodded once, and turned his horse and rode away, and the other three followed. And soon they were just silhouettes, and then dust, and then nothing but memory, and the sound of hoofbeats fading. The four men rode away, and Thomas and his mother stood watching them go. And for the first time in 2 years, the cabin felt like it might become a home again. Everett Stone didn't look back, but he felt different, lighter, like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for decades. Cord rode up beside him and said, "You getting soft in your old age." But there was no judgment, just curiosity. Everett was quiet, and then said, "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of being hard." They rode in silence, the sun hot now, and Jimmy Cross started humming some song his mother used to sing, and Raoul lit another cigar, and the four men looked like just four men instead of outlaws, at least from a distance. Word spread through Redemption Flats about what had happened, stories changing in the telling. But everyone agreed on one thing. The boy had asked the outlaws to kill his stepfather, and they'd done something impossible, shown mercy without showing weakness, solved violence with the threat of violence, but not its execution, and somehow that made the story stranger and more powerful. Thomas Webb grew up in that cabin with his mother, working the land, eventually buying the property when he turned 18, and he never saw his stepfather again, because Marcus drifted north and died 3 years later from drinking bad whiskey in a town nobody remembered. Thomas's mother remarried when he was 16 to a kind man named Samuel, who worked at the mill and who never raised his hand to anyone, and she lived to be 63 and died peaceful in her sleep, with Thomas holding her hand. Thomas married a woman named Elizabeth when he was 22, a school teacher with kind eyes, and they had 4 children who grew up knowing their father was gentle. Thomas kept the leather pouch with the $43 on a shelf in his bedroom for his entire life. Never spent a single coin. Kept it as a reminder of the day he'd been brave enough to ask for help, and lucky enough to find men who gave him something better than what he asked for. He told the story to his children and grandchildren, always ending it the same way, saying that 4 men with guns and blood on their hands had saved his life without firing a single shot, had taught him that strength wasn't about hurting, but about protecting, and that the bravest thing he ever did was ask for help when he needed it most. Everett Stone rode with his 3 companions for another 4 years, robbing stages and banks and living rough. But something had changed that morning. Some calculation had shifted, and increasingly, he found himself letting people go when he should have killed them, showing mercy when mercy made no practical sense. In 1891, he got shot during a bank robbery in New Mexico, took a bullet through the lung, and he survived but barely. And while recovering, he decided he was done. He split his money between Cord, Jimmy, and Raoul, shook their hands, and rode east to Kansas where his sister lived, and he spent his last years working her farm and never touched a gun again. People in Kansas never knew who he'd been, and he preferred it that way. Preferred to be just Everett, the quiet man who was good with horses and who sometimes stared at the horizon like he was looking for something he'd lost, or maybe found too late. He died in 1899, 58 years old, and at his funeral his sister read from the Bible and said he'd been a good man who'd made mistakes and found redemption. And she wasn't wrong, even if she didn't know the whole story. The boy, the outlaws, the cabin, the choice to show mercy instead of dealing death, All of it became one of those stories people told around fires and at bars, the kind that changes depending on who's telling it, but whose core truth remains the same. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing, and sometimes the men you expect to bring death bring something else instead. Something stranger and more valuable, something like hope. Cord died in 1895 from gangrene after a horse stepped on his foot, died cursing, but surrounded by friends. Jimmy Cross went straight eventually, married a widow with 3 children, and became a deputy in Colorado. And he was a good deputy, fair and just, and he never killed anyone in the line of duty. Raul Mendoza went back to Mexico and bought a small ranch and raised horses, beautiful horses that people came from miles around to buy. And he lived until 1912, an old man by then, telling stories to his grandchildren about his days as an outlaw. Thomas Webb lived to be 72, and he told the story himself sometimes, to his children and grandchildren. Always ending it the same way, saying that 4 men with guns and blood on their hands had saved his life without firing a single shot, had taught him that strength wasn't about hurting, but about protecting, and that the bravest thing he ever did was ask for help when he needed it most, and that the strangest thing was getting help from men who everyone said were beyond redemption. The cabin still stands, though it's been rebuilt twice and expanded, and the land around it grows wheat now, golden in the summer sun, waves of grain moving in the wind like water. And if you stand in front of it at dawn when the light is just right, you can almost see shadows of what was, a boy with a split lip, a woman with bruises fading. 4 men on horses riding away toward a horizon that held both their past and their future, both their sins and their single moment of grace. And maybe that's what redemption is. Not erasing what you've done, but choosing in one moment to be something other than what you've always been. Choosing mercy when violence would be easier. Choosing to let someone live when killing them would solve everything. Choosing to believe that people can change, even when all the evidence says otherwise. Choosing to be, for just one morning, in one valley under one sky, something better than what you are.